Chapter 1021. Unforge, Cockpit, Affinity. The words stood out to Silas immediately, and his confusion was coloring through. He took a glance toward Lorien, but she seemed just as lost as he was. As for Megan, she was still lost in her own world, trying to figure out if she had anything on hand to memory wipe Silas. But then she started to consider if memory wiping Silas might ruin her plans for the cockpit. And at that point, she began to weigh her options as though something like a memory wipe was really possible. She was sure that there were some organizations out there that had some method of memory wiping, and she might be able to find a way to get her hands on it. But if it wasn't targeted and she accidentally ended up wiping Silas' memory completely, she would just feel bad. Especially if that ruined everything else. As for Silas, he watched the back of this frivolous almost little girl silently. She seemed carefree in a way he didn't think was even possible for this world. I see, so it ends up being pretty much the same out here, huh? Suddenly, Silas felt a bit bored again. It happened silently, and he almost didn't notice his ambition slipping away. If at some point everything returned to level waters and things ended up being just as boring as it had been back on Earth, just with some extra flashy colors, what good was it? That sort of thing didn't excite him at all. Who cared if there were battles? He was sure that there were battles back on Earth too. He had learned enough about enough wars in their history to know that this had to be the case. But that didn't excite him either. It was the process of looking for something new, of challenging himself in new and unique ways, of being in true control of his life that excited him the most. When he could already see the end of the road, and he knew exactly what it took to get there, the fascination wore off quickly. There was something about seeing the stability of the Golden Grove that reminded him exactly of that. That very same, boring, monotonous feel of moving through the laboratories back at his university. There was nothing fun about this at all. Ironically enough, it was then Megan led him into a very laboratory-like room, if you could call it that. The room definitely had the stainless steel, fluorescent light components down to a T, but the main differences were the mess of wires that hung from every which way, plugging into sockets, while some of them just randomly vanished into the ceilings to connect to who knows where. Then at the center of it all, there was a cockpit. Silas could see it now, and he understood why Megan would call it that. It was an arrangement of dozens of miniature screens, some attached to metallic arms, and some not obviously attached anywhere. There was a silvery chair that looked formed of the most uncomfortable metals ever, carrying bumps that aligned with what must have been the spine. The trouble was that the spine was obviously designed for someone of the Unatower race and not the human race, so it was not only much longer and larger, but it was awkwardly shaped in a way that must have aligned with how the Unatower race folded up their horse halves. The mess of wires over there was even worse. They got much thinner than the thick ones that hung from the ceiling. A layman might look at this and see nothing but a rat's nest, but the longer Silas stared at it, the more he felt like he was staring at something truly unique and profound. The wires might look tangled, but they definitely weren't. They all ran from one place to the next, not in a random arrangement, but instead down the shortest path possible. If you did the calculations, all of this was optimized to use the smallest length of wire, and yet for it to look so messy nonetheless, it could only mean that for whoever had built this thing, the calculations came so naturally to them that they did it on the fly. This is Andromeda, our Unforge that was designed by my grandfather. It has been retired for many years now. Though technically speaking, it was never properly introduced in the first place. And why is that? Megan cleared her throat again, tapping at her chest. Quote ellipsis. People tend to die. She said the last part so rapidly that Silas almost missed it. For a top E grade to speak fast, one could imagine just how fast they were speaking in general. The movement of her vocal cords outsped the movement of sound itself, causing them to jumble up into a mess of soft words Silas barely managed to decipher. Died how? Silas asked calmly. Megan looked toward Silas and inwardly she almost rolled her eyes. She had seen many men like this before. A smart person would hear that and run the other direction. Then she would just have to try and coax him back in here, promising to do her best to keep his life. It wasn't as though the death rate was 100%. But then there were men with egos bigger than their heads. Some did it to impress her, while others were just that sort of stubborn, arrogant asshole. When those men heard about this thing, they seemed to want to prove themselves as some sort of alpha that definitely wouldn't die like everyone else did. Ironically enough, it was those few that ended up dying the most frequently. Those that felt out their limits first were just fine. Suddenly, Megane didn't feel all that bad about whether or not Silas died here or not. It would be his fault anyway for not listening to her. This Uniforge is a tool of the Guardians. It's there to help us process and arrange information faster. Chapter 1022. Back End. Quote ellipsis. We do business across hundreds of galaxies and our clients are numbers in the trillions. We probably have millions of different business hubs, but it would be impossible to trust that many different managers. Even if we did manage to do that, and they were trustworthy, just the process of auditing mistakes, or the accumulated mistakes themselves, would be a nightmare to deal with. So your solution is, to put it all in the hands of fewer people. Silas' skepticism was well within his tone. Delegating tasks well was something that any decent leader had to learn how to do. But the Golden Grove actually went in the opposite direction, and that was very odd. It was against every common note of wisdom he had ever seen. It was more than a little bit odd. You'll have to use the Uniforge before you can understand why that is. And what? Die? Megane blinked, seemingly not having expected this answer. She had already pegged Silas as arrogant, so the thought that he would try to use this as leverage for some sort of other power play had already been thrown to the back of her mind. What do you mean by that? Right now I'm a prisoner. I'm still in chains, and I've been told to not become too cocky, according to you. Now, before my trial, I'm supposed to jump into a death trap. Why? Because you say so. Megane was speechless. What was happening here, exactly? This is an opportunity for you. You could have fooled me. I didn't hear anything about an opportunity, all you said was that I could die. Megane didn't even know how to reply to all of this. She was truly struck into silence, and her own mind short-circuited for a bit. Quote ellipsis. What do you want, exactly? Me. I'm not in a position to ask for anything. I'm also not sure of how your rules and regulations work, or if slave labor is something that. We do not use slaves. Megane immediately refuted. Well, if you don't use slaves, then I'll have to reject your offer of entering this death trap. At that moment, the oddity of the situation seemed to finally set in for her. Megane didn't even know what to say. She just stood there in silence, half expecting Silas to just walk off, until she remembered he was chained and she was holding on to the other end of it. At that moment, the oddity of the situation seemed to finally set in for her. Quote ellipsis. All right, forget it, she waved the chain and pulled. Enter the Uniforge and we can write off your crimes. Do you have the authority to do that? Your galaxy is under my jurisdiction. Whether a report gets filed or not is up to me. That's not an answer. Megane's lip twitched. Wasn't this guy supposed to be falling all over himself to please her? Wasn't he supposed to be arrogantly proclaiming that this wouldn't be much of an effect on his life? Lorian's eyes bounced back and forth between the two of them and then sighed inwardly. This Megane girl might be a genius, but she was just a 20-something-year-old. Clearly, Lorian had no idea that Silas had only just had his 27th birthday not long ago. Not that he noticed, given all the time dilations he was constantly suffering under. Keeping track of dates, especially for something so insignificant, wasn't something he had the time or bandwidth to bother with. Either way, she was starting to feel bad for Megane. I do have the authority, okay. Silas gave her a look and then nodded, walking past her toward the cockpit. The girl gave a little snort, feeling dissatisfied, but knowing that there wasn't much to pick at with Silas' performance. He hadn't done anything wrong, but maybe that was even more annoying than if he had. She felt Lorian's gaze on her and turned, but Lorian had already looked away. Megane shook her head. This was technically a top-secret location, but she had been so lost in her own head that she had brought an unknown third party here. Her grandpa would definitely berate her for this if he ever found out. Wait, if she was right, he would definitely find out. She pouted and gave Silas another glare, only to be surprised instantly. Was he dead, already? Silas just sat there in the awkwardly shaped chair, his spine having been pierced through by the bumps. There was no movement, no whirring lights, no shuddering runes. There was just nothingness. Silas didn't know what was going on in the outside world. He felt like he was falling through an abyss, moving faster and faster as though the world itself was rapidly changing around him and out of his control. But then he landed. The world stabilized around him and he seemed to have reached an anchor point. What is this? Though Silas asked the question, he wasn't being literal. That was because he had felt something similar before. A nexus. Was he in a nexus right now? No, not a nexus, but the hubs connecting one. Is this a place that connects all the hubs of the Golden Grove? A highway of speed information suddenly began to form. Like fiber optics cables rapidly signaling light in all directions, there was a new mess of wires formed around Silas, but this time the mess came and went, fading in and then fading out. Silas reached out and touched one, but then he hurriedly pulled back, his eyes opening wide. He honestly couldn't believe it. That girl, that Unatower, she wouldn't be so stupid as to give him access to such a thing, right? The swirling mass of lights continued to accelerate around Silas as the reality of the situation he was in began to settle in properly. He was right, this really was the hub of the Nexus, a foundation for all of the Golden Grove's transactions. If Silas wanted, he could tweak one number here and crash their stock market. Or he could shift one lane there and suddenly make himself the richest man in this galaxy cluster. And because he was in the back end, there was no one at all to track him. If Megan had known this was possible, she definitely wouldn't have allowed it. So how could she possibly know either? What the hell was she thinking? Chapter 1023. Decision. Silas wasn't sure what to do for a while. It was a rare feeling for him. Or maybe it was just rare in recent memory. He had a paralysis of choice, and it almost felt like he could do too much. Suddenly being handed down the power to collapse an organization that worked on the scale of galaxies. It was something that was hard to even wrap your head around properly. And then he calmed down. No, things aren't that easy. It was one thing to sense that he could do something, another matter to execute on it. There was something very special about the way this uniform worked. To Silas, it felt like his progenitor flame abilities had just gotten a huge boost. Supported by this machine, it was like he had reached to the very ends of the time rune legacy, and layered on top of that with a space rune legacy of his own creation. The two came together, and thanks to this uniform, his mental capacity had increased to the point it rivaled that of D grades easily. Maybe even beyond. In fact, that was what was so special about Andromeda in the first place. The greatest weakness of Uniforces was that they required exceptional will and mental capacity to operate. Unless someone's wisdom and will stats were at a certain level, even stepping into a Uniforge could mean death to the mind and soul. Because of this, there were always limitations in scaling Uniforges, and while they were a great tool, they were far more akin to a bike you might ride as opposed to a sports car. Sure, a bike would definitely take you from point A to point B with much greater efficiency, and far less fatigue. But what good was it compared to something with a real engine? What Megan's grandfather was looking for was exactly that engine for the mind, and the only method he had found to do it was this. Space and time. Or, more accurately, tapping into the mesh of reality in order to simplify and streamline things in a way that only Mother Nature and the laws of the universe could. It was objectively a work of art, a stroke of true genius. That no one could use. Having a space will ability was impossibly rare already. Having a time will ability was even rarer and practically unheard of. To have both at the same time, well, that was an anomaly that might not have appeared more than a handful of times. And to think that Silas had only stumbled onto it on a whim because he thought he took a liking to how their simplified runes looked and felt. What Silas mistook for easy, was actually something that was next to impossible for every single person that had stepped into this cockpit. And now, he was feeling the weight of it all. Sitting there, with the mental capacity of AD grade for the first time in his life, Silas thought through several things. Would it do him a great deal of benefit to take advantage of this situation right here and now? Yes it would. In fact, if he managed to figure out how to rearrange the back end properly, he could change the permissions of the level 30 bazaar. With this, assuming he didn't want to take the risk of just making himself the richest man in the whole galaxy, giving himself money he couldn't even use without drawing a ridiculous amount of attention to begin with, he could easily skate by and launder money. The yearly funds of the level 30 bazaar had already been so much that Silas could hardly see straight. With it, he had bought himself 80,000 silver genes, and he had hardly left a dent in it. If he could launder money through the bazaar with such ease, would he even have to worry about resources again until he was approaching D grade? The thoughts and possibilities came one after another, faster and faster, and soon he had so many schemes he couldn't even begin to list them all in a timely fashion. And yet, he still had one question remaining. What should he do? If he took the honest route, straightforwardly spoke of what happened, and then gained the favor of the Golden Grove, what would happen? Would he just become a pencil pusher for the guild? Was he just going to be a useful pawn and organize all their missions and calculate their monthly expenses for them? And what if he just said forget everything and robbed them blind? That wouldn't really benefit him either. Not only would he have a large sum of money he wouldn't be able to use freely and without worry until he became a D grade, likely even C grade anyway, the crumbling of the Golden Grove would be a problem. Silas didn't know a lot about the power structures in these galaxies at all. But what he did know from his interactions with the Golden Grove so far was that they were surprisingly fair. This wasn't just from his interaction with the Inspector and Megan, though his experience with the former definitely held far more weight than the latter. But it was also about the opportunities they had given Lorien, and also how open and above board their selection for Zars were. And then, most importantly, there was that feather that Lorien got her hands on. Silas didn't know much about the Thriskai either, but what he did know was that the enemy of his enemy was his friend. What if taking out the Golden Grove gave the Thriskai the lane they needed to do something that would only harm him in the future? These thoughts swayed and moved about in Silas' skull almost as though they were being sloshed about. The fluidity of his thought was something that surprised even him, but eventually he made a decision. Silas' eyes slowly opened, only to find Megan practically nose to nose with him. Chapter 1024. For now. Megan hurriedly jumped back the instant Silas opened his eyes, so startled that she almost smashed her head and body against the series of wires and screens. When she landed, she was already heaving out heavy breaths, placing a palm to her chest in shock. You're alive. Silas stared at her for a moment before he replied. He was trying to understand if he had done something that would make him seem dead. Normally, he would be far too ignorant to decide exactly what that was, but in the moments he had spent in the Uniforge, as much as it took a great deal of self-control, he had focused on the task at hand. That task being that he stepped out with all the leverage in the palm of his hands. And he felt like he had accomplished that. There were few issues, Silas said. Few issues. Part of Megan was skeptical, but then she turned her gaze toward the line of spinal connections between Silas and the Uniforge, and there was little she could do to refute it. The reason why she thought Silas was dead was because there should at least be some reaction from the Uniforge when a connection was established. Fans should spin up, its computing systems should be kicked into high gear, the room, at the very least, should start to heat up. But none of that happened. After some thought, Megan reached a conclusion, that being that Silas might have had the affinity to make the Uniforge work, but he didn't have the strength of will or wisdom necessary to actually stress it and make it work. This seemed like an adequate enough answer for what was going on here. And it was also the answer that Silas was fairly confident she would come to. It was also the answer he wanted her to come to. There was no world that the Golden Grove would be foolish enough to allow him unfettered access to their back end just because he was a talent. They didn't know him, he didn't descend from any of their powerhouses or heads, and there was no guarantee they would be able to control him when he grew into his strength and power. What would most likely happen if they learned the true extent of just how far he could go was, well, restrictions. Whoever built this thing would most definitely come into place fetters on what Silas could and couldn't accomplish with it. Of course, this would likely happen regardless as a form of caution if these people were smart. Before it was fine because no one could actually use it, but now that things were different, that added layer of protection just made sense. However, Silas felt that he could delay it for a bit. He had decided that this opportunity wasn't one he could miss, not because it could make him rich, not because he could bring the Golden Grove crashing down to its knees, but instead because of one thing. Information. Silas knew that he had a huge gap in knowledge between himself and everyone else who was born and raised in this world. Things they took for granted, common knowledge they had casually picked up in their youth, were things that he probably couldn't even fathom understanding right now. But with this Unforge, just a few days would be enough. Those few days wouldn't make him some treasure trove of information, but it would certainly make him far more knowledgeable than the vast majority of people in this galaxy cluster, and that was exactly what he needed. Just now, he had only spent the equivalent of about 20 seconds or so in the Unforge. Not only did he learn all the superficial and surrounding information about Unforges themselves, but he understood everything about the power structure of the Golden Grove, who he could offend, who he couldn't, what the relationships between them were, and he had grasped maybe the key to it all. Where was the Beast Warlord Sanctum? How could he get there? What was their position in relation to the Golden Grove? All of that information was in his mind right now. What was maybe even more interesting than any of this, and a curious benefit that even Silas wasn't expecting was, my wisdom increased, and not by a small margin either. Just by using the Unforge, he not only gained a great deal of knowledge, but he gained a cheat to increase his wisdom by a ridiculous margin. No, it wasn't a cheat. This was only possible because he had over 4,000 bronze wisdom genes. His body was in a state where it wanted to flourish and grow, it just needed a training medium that would allow it to do so. And ironically enough, he had run right into it. Now, he had a step up in talent and a step up in knowledge and understanding. His confidence in making it out of here unscathed had increased severalfold. I see, it must be because you're still in the F grade, then. This is good, this is good. Megian's disappointment was quickly washed away when she realized this. She was too used to the young people around Scylla's age already being well into the E grade even if most of them weren't as good as her. She had forgotten that Scylla's wasn't from here. Not only would there be a chance for him to improve, but it would be worth investing in him to help out his foundation. If he could make use of Andromeda, he just might become another pillar of the guild. This was huge. She had to tell her grandfather about this as soon as possible. She didn't want to bother the old man because she wasn't sure yet if Silas could even manage it. But now, Megan released a little squeal and rushed off. Her horn vanished and her lower half flashed into the body of a beautiful white steed with a tail of shimmering white gold filaments, and she jetted off, vanishing in a wrap of white light. In the end, she left Lorien and Silas right there. Silas could only shake his head. How many opportunities was this girl going to give him? Unfortunately, for now, he had to pretend to be too tired to continue. For now. Chapter 1025. Too weak. What did you do? Lorien finally couldn't help but ask something after Megan vanished. But all she received in return was a glance from Silas and then nothing at all. Inwardly, she could only shake her head. She didn't know what else she expected. Honestly speaking, this was a good opportunity for her. She was technically out of Silas' control right now, and this would be the best chance for her to escape. She had already crossed Silas' boundaries by choosing to come, but by the same token, Silas didn't seem to care very much about her in specific anymore. But, when she thought about it, that made sense too. Why would he care when he already understood her plans? In fact, right now, he was in a far better position than she was to execute on those plans. Lorien didn't know what this Unforged thing was, her understanding of Golden Grove was very limited, and now it was certainly far, far, far beneath that of Silas after his stint inside of one. But what she did know was enough about the Unatower race to know that they were the true movers and shakers in this guild. And more importantly than that, she knew enough to know that Silas had somehow gained their favor just moments after stepping foot here. She didn't have the upper hand in anything anymore outside of knowing that Silas had his hands on a feather he certainly shouldn't have. But did she even have the leverage to make use of that? Not to mention how much danger just the mention of it would put her in. Having this information was useless unless she could make it to the right people to let them know what was going on. Imagine a normal day-to-day citizen got information that a rival country was going to nuke their own in a few days. Would this private citizen even have a method to get this news to the president? Would anyone even believe them if they ran around the streets yelling about it? That was the position Lorien suddenly found herself in, and she didn't need to think to know that Silas was smart enough to figure that out too. Suddenly, their roles had not only been completely reversed, but she was at a point where she couldn't even carry Silas' shoes. From defeating him on what had once been the biggest stage, she was now an ant that had a hard time even meeting the look in his eyes. The change was so abrupt that it stabbed at her chest. It was no wonder Silas didn't bother to accept her offer of becoming his wife. He didn't need to do so at all. Lorien tried to speak again, but her voice trailed off. She closed her eyes and exhaled. When she opened them again, she found that Silas was still looking at her calmly. Then, a notification popped up on Silas' screen. Contract invitation received from Lorien Mist. Silas stared at the notification for a long while. This time, it wasn't a marriage contract, it wasn't even remotely an equivalent contract at all. In fact, the only clauses Lorien left in there to protect herself were ones about her race. Instead, she built the contract off of a merit-based system. The more useful she was to Silas, the more effort he had to put into helping her race. The two came hand in hand. Silas couldn't go through it as fast as he could with the Unforge, but his wisdom had gotten such a huge bump just now that it still didn't take him very long at all. When he got near the bottom, he raised an eyebrow and gave Lorien a look. "Do not look at me like that," she said with surprising firmness. "I may have played a character for Ulrich, but I would have never let him touch me unless he gave me what I wanted. If the optics of it alone bother you so much, then you're free to remove the clause if you want." Because their wills were connected right now, Lorien could feel just how fast Silas was going through the contract, and she could also tell what parts of it he had reached. Despite this, rather than being embarrassed, she just met his gaze calmly. "I'm also not a child. You're overdrawing yourself far too much. The speed of your evolution is outpacing your foundation. The more you overshoot it, the more difficulty you're going to have reigning in your will and libido. I do not know how many women you have back at home, but you have none following by your side. It will begin to affect your judgment if you don't do something about it. And you're the one who can fix that. You're from a summoned world, so you don't know. But this is a very common sickness, especially amongst those like you who come from small worlds and then accelerate upward. Your body is a vessel that the system is feeding, but that vessel has yet to adapt. All it feels is a constant bombardment of danger and vast improvement. It feels the volatility of the current state of your life and it wants to leave behind contingency plans. Every time you rearrange the foundation of your genes, you're connecting with the very essence of evolution itself and the laws that guide the world. That's the only way it's possible. If you don't start spreading your seed, that potential lingering within you will begin to lash out and suppress your advancement. There are actually many techniques designed to do this more effectively. Silas looked at her calmly for a long while before he finally spoke. "I can understand the logic, but if what you're saying is correct, then the strength of the woman involved is just as important. Right now, don't you think you're too weak to be that for me? Or is it that you want me to invest in you so that you can keep up?" Lorien's eyes became chilly, but she didn't respond. It was as good as an affirmative. Chapter 1026. Excellent. The two stared at each other for a long while. Silas had felt what Lorien was talking about as early as the trial of the summoning. When he first entered the Basilisk King's dungeon, he had undergone what could be considered his first major evolution, and his body reacted in the wildest of ways. Back on Earth, it was already commonly understood that death and being around death did something odd to the libidos of people. It was often explained as a drive for procreation, an instinct to pass on one's genes before they could be wasted in death. But this was on a completely other level from that. Lorien probably had no idea just how right she was by mentioning potential, but Silas could feel it intimately now that Taboo Bond had reached level 50 in earnest. Every time he rearranged his genes, or added some new unique skills to his body that he wasn't naturally born with, he had to connect to something particularly primal within him. That primal aspect of him was the most bestial essence of who he and everyone around him were. It was what drove people, what decided the underlying reasons for all their actions. It was the nature part of everyone, that could only then be trimmed and controlled by nurture. The more Silas pressed on that gas pedal, the more prominent those feelings became. He realized it all the more intimately after that incident with Meghine. If he hadn't closed his eyes, he wasn't even sure if he could have controlled the rushing of his own blood. However, understanding was one thing. Accepting it was a different matter entirely. Silas accepted the contract only because taking out that clause would be a waste of his time. But that didn't mean that he had any intention of using it. If nothing else, it would make sure that Lorien stayed in line. Part of it was for Cassere's sake, but there was a much larger part of Silas that just refused to be ruled by his own carnal desires. He had been a man of great discipline all his life, and he had no intention of changing now. If it was necessary, he wasn't opposed to doing what needed to be done. But by the same token, he had a greed seed inside of him that would likely require powerful will anyway. Why not just kill two birds with one stone? There was a light tremble in Lorien's pupils when she felt the link form, but after a breath, she was able to calm down. She had already thought about this enough. There was no other way at this point. This path made sure that she wouldn't be discarded, and also would help carve out a path for her missed race. As Silas rose, if she could prove herself useful, so too would she and her race. That was what mattered the absolute most. She would make sure that everything she did counted for double. She lowered her head. I felt that you need a release already. But if you could please wait until we reach a more private location, I would be grateful. Her tone was almost oddly demure, when Silas knew for a fact that the woman before him was arrogant down to her bones. Tell me, Silas suddenly started out of curiosity. Don't women feel the same way? Lorien looked up. It depends on the race. The mating strategies of some alien races are a lot like men, in which case the answer to your question would be yes. Some races also have men that have mating strategies more like the women you are familiar with, in which case they won't feel like you even though they are men. This corner of the universe is more in line with what you're used to, but other corners aren't necessarily so. At least from my understanding. And your missed race. I'm sure you know the answer to that. It's why we chase after the highest status male we can find. And control. The control aspect is just something you added yourself. That's not actually part of your mating strategy, now is it? Lorien froze for a moment, suddenly understanding what Silas was getting at. Silas nodded and it made Lorien tremble. She could tell that no matter what she said now, it wouldn't matter. Essentially, she was still a lurking danger. If Silas helped her to accelerate her improvement, then she might very well reach a state of heat as well. If she fell in love with one of Silas' enemies and ended up hardly able to control herself, then she would become a liability. The reason chaosheir loved him so much even though she had never said it in so many words was because she knew he would put himself on the line to protect her. Protection. Silas wasn't arrogant enough to believe that that man would definitely be him. Only a fool would think looks and strength were enough to attract a woman, especially an intelligent woman like Lorien. The reason chaosheir loved him so much even though she had never said it in so many words was because she knew he would put himself on the line to protect her. Protection. Did Lorien have the same reassurance? Of course not. Because of that, there was no certainty that the man Lorien fell for would be him. In fact, logically speaking, he would probably be the last man she fell for. Suddenly, Lorien almost felt like she had signed her soul away for no reason. This was not enough to gain Silas' trust at all. He might even just place her on a back burner somewhere and forget about her existence. Lorien was about to say something when there was a sudden strong pulse of ether and an old man with a mess of white hair that could only be classified as furious appeared, his hand on the shoulder of a familiar young lady. He rode forward in a wheelchair that seemed far too large for his top half, but Silas assumed he must still be in his horse form. You, hurry into the Underforge. I need to see this for myself. Silas gave the man a look and then did as he was told. Not even a few seconds later he had been ripped out, his shoulders gripped tightly. For the second time that day, he was practically nose to nose with Arunatower. Excellent, 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 come, we're registering you immediately, I have so many experiments. The old man seemed to have lost his mind. Chapter 1027. Protocol. Everything began to move at what felt like lightning speed. Silas was registered for things he didn't even have the time to process and then thrown through orientations that didn't seem to have much to do with what he would be responsible for at all. But he began to realize that something was wrong quite quickly. It made sense that Megan was a bit naive and haphazard with the way she did things, but the fact that her grandfather would be the same was odd. It was either that this family was just so quirky, or the other foot would be dropping very soon. Very soon was an understatement. Silas was just in the process of his final security clearance checks and registrations when the situation changed. Hurry it up, Meg. Didn't I teach you better than this? You do it then. Megine let out an exasperated sigh. Silas raised an eyebrow when the old man fell into silence when she said this. Something was definitely wrong. If he was so insistent on speed, while Megine was a bit rude about it, especially considering he was her grandfather, there shouldn't be a reason why he wouldn't do it himself. If he could create Unaforges, then he should know how to use them too. Silas didn't feel any pressure coming from the old man at all. But this didn't put him at ease. He could still feel the inspector even though he was in the D grade. But this old man was unfathomable compared to that. He must have been beyond the D grade, or maybe in the furthest, deepest reaches of it. If that was the case, there was no question who between he and his granddaughter would be faster. It seems I've gotten myself into the mix of something troublesome again. Silas had come to understand much more about the structure of the Golden Grove, but while he had some guesses about what was happening, that didn't mean that he was completely knowledgeable of everything. Finding general knowledge was easy enough in a medium like that one. But teasing apart what were basically open secrets and common knowledge to these people was actually much tougher. Who had had rivalries for many years? Who liked whom? Who disliked who? These felt like superficial questions, and it was because of that they were so much more difficult to handle. And yet, Silas wasn't surprised at all when someone suddenly burst into the room. Silas' gaze calmly turned toward the door to find yet another odd race looking right at him. The man's skin was golden, a single blue gem embedded right into the middle of his forehead. Somehow, his hair looked more like sculpted metal than it did real hair. Silas would have thought that it was a helmet or treasure of some sort if his senses didn't clearly pick up that it was truly part of the man's body. A man of golden metal. An Auran, Silas concluded. Though he asked it as though it was a question, he was fairly certain that this was the answer. But the Auran immediately froze when he saw the old man. Clearly, he realized that this was vastly above his pay grade. Still, he knew that if he took a step out now, he would most definitely pay for it later. Stop, what is going on here? Don't stop, Meg, the old man said calmly. Unfortunately, it wasn't his decision to make. The Unaforged Megine was working with suddenly had the power that was running it cut off. The Auran had pulled out some sort of keycard and overrode Megine's authority. Silas was only speculating on what was happening from a third party's perspective, but he was fairly sure that he was right judging by the shifts in the runes and things of the like. What do you think you're doing? An imposing air came from the old man, almost forcing the Auran to his knees. Old sage, Brahma, this isn't according to protocol. I am only doing my job. Single quote ellipsis. Interesting. It seemed that the relationship between the Aurans and Unataurs wasn't so harmonious. No, that isn't the case. If I remember correctly. With this added context, Silas began to piece together some other things he had seen in the Unaforged until he came to an understanding. The Aurans and Unataurs were actually quite harmonious, but that didn't mean that there weren't some within them that weren't ostracized. There was a mention of an incident related to Unaforges in the past. A certain creator wanted to take liberties with the Golden Grove's resources and experiment with a procedure that just might have a very high death rate. However, the details of that experiment were kept very vague. That had interested Silas because he was already at the point where he had no restrictions on what he could access in the first place. For it to still be so censored, just what were they trying to hide? He had thought of the possibility of this Unaforged being Andromeda, but he hadn't been 100% certain because it seemed odd that something so heavily censored even to the elite would be so easily accessible by someone like Megine and, well, him as well. But now, he was almost certain these two incidents were one and the same, and it should have resulted in the old man being ostracized. I remember the inspector also knowing about this, though. Is that because Megine was too willful and explained? Or is it an open secret as well? What Silas was even more curious about was what about the Unaforged was so dangerous. It truly didn't feel all that dangerous to him. In fact, it was a walk in the park. I think that's about enough, don't you think, old Brahma? The voice came out of nowhere and it soothed the old man's aura out of the air. Then, the projection of a man who looked identical to what Silas might expect out of a real-life Buddha appeared, radiating golden light down from above. Chapter 1028. Sorry. Old Brammer's face turned malevolent for just a moment before he calmed down. He exhaled a breath and shook his head. To Scylla's surprise, he then turned his gaze toward him. Sorry, boy. Scylla's raised an internal eyebrow. Sorry for what, exactly? For dragging him into this mess. Niavon, what brings you here today? The old man asked calmly. I think you know that already. I felt you trying to speed someone through the protocols. It seems you have a little bit of respect after all. Well, I wouldn't blame a little girl from being influenced by her own grandfather, now would I? Do you think I'm some sort of monster only here to target you? The mistakes you've made are of your own making. My Auran race and your Unatowers had a harmonious relationship otherwise. Don't speak to me as though I am a child. What do you want? Oh, you're so insistent on this. This is already the third time you've done this. The result in the end is always the same. Just say it. You know the rules, old Brammer. You can't give someone this sort of clearance unless they've both proven themselves trustworthy and actually worthy. Talent is just one aspect. Unless he can walk the Golden Grove, the rest is worthless. You know well that the Golden Grove is nothing more than a fairy tale. Your ancestors would be sad to hear you say that. And yours would be rolling in the graves watching you hold the guild back for the sake of immediate profits over long-term growth. In case you've forgotten, old Brammer, your little project isn't just some minor inconvenience. You wiped out half of our capital in just 30 years. You were given more than enough rope. Don't pretend as though you are a victim now. Old Brammer sneered. And how much have my Unaforges made back for you? For me, I have personally made no money from them at all. If you want to speak of the Golden Grove, then you have indeed done a great service. But it isn't the place of the old to ruin the futures of the young. Old Brammer waved a hand, starting to get annoyed all over again. The image in the air wavered wildly and almost shattered, but just barely managed to wiggle its way back to existence. I'll take that as a yes, then, the Buddha projection said with a smile. Finally, he turned to Scylla's for the first time. Megine will escort you to where you need to go. And Niavon frowned, looking at Lorien as though he didn't really understand why she was here. After a while, he shook his head as though he couldn't be bothered. Then vanished. What is the Golden Grove? Scylla's asked as though he didn't already know the answer. The old man looked at him, sighed again, and then vanished. Scylla's raised an eyebrow and looked at Megine. Come with me. For the first time, Scylla's entered a location of the Golden Grove that was surrounded by true hustle and bustle. Races of all shapes and sizes walked around, each one seemingly hurrying as though their hair had been lit on fire. It reminded Scylla's a lot of how Megine and her grandfather had been running around earlier. It seemed that this was just the natural state of these merchants. Many turned to look at Scylla's. But it was hard to tell if that was because he was the only natural human here, or if it was because of Megine. What he did notice, though, was that Megine, while she refused a few glances, didn't have many people who lingered on her at all. It seemed that she flew under the radar for the most part. At the center of a huge open-concept foyer, there was a golden tree with a thickness in the hundreds of meters. Its canopy seemed to cover the dome of the skies, and countless receptionist desks were carved into its body. Megine, almost too quickly, walked up to one and spoke out a string of words. Golden Grove Trial. Scylla shook his head inwardly. She still hadn't explained it at all, but he also knew why. This time it wasn't because she was incompetent, but instead because explaining would actually be a detriment. The test wasn't exactly the same every time, and ironically enough, if you couldn't figure out the best path forward yourself, then you would be out of luck. The trial itself, though, wasn't just a test of talent, but also character. Which was actually exactly why Scylla's understood the way the old man felt. Much like how Scylla's felt about his will when he first entered this world. How could you possibly test his character? It turned out that he was right about will. The system wasn't very good at measuring it at all, and ultimately, two people with the exact same stat points could have vastly different will strengths. And now, this thing was definitely far inferior to the system. So what chance did it stand in testing something so complex? Scylla suddenly frowned, his gaze turning sharp as he looked around. Megine had spoken the word so quickly and suddenly, almost muttering it under her breath. And yet, almost the entire foyer froze, countless gazes looking over. For him, the receptionist asked calmly as though she couldn't sense the change. Yes, Megan said even quicker. Place your hand here, please. You'll be teleporting in. She waited for Silas to put his hand down before the countdown began. Quote ellipsis. 3, 2. Silas felt an odd sense sweep over him, but his senses were sharp enough to know it wasn't coming from the runes he had just placed his hand on. He looked back to see an Auron approaching from a distance, his age likely around the same as Megan. There was a sharpness to him the other Aurons he had met hadn't had, and while there was a refreshing smile on his face, Silas could feel the ill intent. Quote ellipsis. 1. Silas vanished. Chapter 1029. Frustration. Silas' eyes opened to a road of gold. It seemed to consume his vision, making it hard for him to see anything at all in his periphery until he forcefully ripped himself away. He frowned and then looked around at the rest of the world, only to find that it was equally as gold. The skies, the trees, the grass by the roadside. There was an almost painful beauty to the world, almost like it was perfect to the point of imperfection, beautiful to the point of ugliness. It didn't carry the same sort of asymmetry or slight faults that a world probably should have. Every leaf was the exact same, every blade of grass angled in the same way, even the rays of the sun felt almost artificial. Silas began to get a headache staring at the world, almost like he had an urge to fix it, to rearrange things. He didn't like what he was seeing at all. Oh, seems like I was a step late. In the outside world, the Auron came to a stop 3 or so meters from Megan with a smile on his face. Though he was obviously talking to Megan, his head had tilted up to the skies as he observed something flash onto the screen above. In that moment, the enormous golden tree had a few branches flex and aim themselves downward, tapping at the air and causing golden ripples to spread out. These ripples became screens of light, which soon solidified into the pictures of a familiar man. Silas. The image reflected Silas staring at the world around him with a tight frown on his face, looking from blade of grass to tree leaf to ray of sun, unable to decipher and settle into exactly what he was seeing. Unfortunate. It seems like he's struggling already, the Auron said lightly. Megan frowned and looked away from the young man toward the screen. Seeing Silas just standing there, she began to feel some worry. But then she noticed something, and her eyes flickered. This was a very common thing for newcomers to the Golden Grove, especially when their talent was severely lacking. Even if Silas had a rare dual-will affinity, that didn't mean that they were particularly strong, and given the galaxy he came from, the odds of his foundation being anything decent were highly unlikely. But there was still a difference between Silas and those people. Those people, their eyes were always stuck on the road. Silas was clearly looking elsewhere, though, as though he was distressed about something completely different from what normal people were distressed about when entering the road. It was just that. Megan didn't know where that difference stemmed from or what it represented. You know, Miss Megan, you should really consider speaking to your grandfather. I know my own and yours haven't always seen eye to eye, but the asset that your grandfather is can't be understated. Digging himself into a bigger and bigger hole every time like this can't be good for the health of your family, and it certainly isn't good for the guild overall. Zayas, how about you do me a favor and shove it? Megan snapped, her temper flaring. I'm trying to watch something, and you're interrupting me. Zayas only smiled lightly. As you wish, I'm more than willing to allow my future wife to be a little willful. Megan ignored the words as though she hadn't heard them at all. She had heard them so many times by now that she might as well have had a permanent filter in her ears for them. To the side, Lorien didn't even dare to look at any one of these two. Her eyes would have even been glued to the floor if not for the fact she had only just tied herself to Silas' success and failure. She couldn't afford a loss right now. No, she couldn't afford him to lose. She had to try her best not to turn to Megan and ask a laundry list of questions. Silas could get away with it because he was useful to her. But who was she? Lorien clenched her teeth. She had to grow stronger no matter what. Silas' frown only deepened with every passing moment, his frustration growing. It felt like something was latching onto not just his will, but his demonic will in particular. He hadn't calculated for this. How could he have known that demonic will would have this sort of impact? The Golden Grove world was essentially like the Rune Secret Realm but with a much heavier emphasis on will rather than will comprehension. In fact, it was very similar to the lost city of greed in that it tested his urges. The further you walked along the road, the greater the impulse of money and riches would become. If you walked too fast, you would fall harder and faster. But if you walked too slow, then you would eventually be consumed nonetheless. The trick was to find the perfect pace forward for yourself, not chasing after something that was too great for you, or limiting yourself to what was small and insignificant out of fear, cowardice, or inadequacy. Along the way, there would eventually be some actual runic challenges, most involving sums of money, directing traffic, streamlining cash flow. But in rune form. It was quite a cleverly constructed challenge, one that Silas knew he could blow by with ease. The runes that challenged his money savvy were just designed to force him to find their most efficient routes. As a runespark master, it was an absolute joke. He could not only clear this realm, but do it in record time. It was just a matter of how fast he wanted to go. Luckily, he had already seen the entire list, so he already understood exactly how much to hold back. What he didn't expect was that the moment he stepped into this place, he would realize that the truth of this realm was far deeper than he imagined. Suddenly, the confusion and frustration on Silas' face vanished. I see. Chapter 10:30. Who? There was a flicker in Silas' eyes, and he wondered how he should proceed. Now, the frustration in his eyes was very different from what he had been experiencing before. The Golden Grove had been incapable of pulling on his will hard enough to truly affect him, not when he had forged will. That level was probably higher than even Megin and Zayas. It was hard to fathom how someone as young as Silas could have a will at this level to begin with. But even compared to those with forging will, Silas was on another level. That was because he had demonic will as well. The combination of the two made his will closer to a level beyond his current one than it was comparable to those at the same level. It could be said that in this case, Silas was over-leveled in more ways than one, which was why he had to hold back in the first place. It wasn't just a matter of feeling like he would be forced into a marriage he didn't want again, but also that he didn't want the old man or anyone for that matter to know just how much he could do with the Unforged. Not just yet. But this opportunity here, it left Silas itching at something in his heart. The Golden Grove is interesting. It seems. I'll have to press the gas pedal just a little bit, then. Silas took a breath and then exhaled. He bent down into a squat and then rolled up to the balls of his feet. With a push, his calves exploded with power, and his thighs practically bulged out of their pants as he leapt high into the air. Madness control turned the simple movement into an engine revving in his body. His blood flow hit its peak, and in an instant, he went from cold to steaming, his body limber and pulsing with might. Bang! Silas shot off, his body streaking across the golden road so fast that he practically looked as though he wasn't touching the ground at all. His hair flowed behind him, streaks of lightning pulling at his mind. It was then Silas got a little glimpse of what his new madness control could do. He wasn't just embodying a perfect understanding of his body, but something deeper. His affinities themselves were beginning to guide the fluidity of his movement. He didn't need something like cryobane elevation to poison his body into being stronger anymore because it was happening naturally. His muscles twitched faster and reacted with greater sharpness as though embodying lightning. His blood was running hot, yet he didn't feel anywhere near close to overheating, as though embodying ice. His heart pumped faster and faster as though its control valves had been turned entirely off, as though embodying poison. One stride after another pulled him forward, and in that moment, he seemed to truly be flying, his steps only becoming quicker and quicker. Bang! Silas felt a great amount of air resistance until he suddenly ripped right through it, accelerating further. In the outside world, everyone had just been watching Silas stand there for minutes on end. Everyone thought that it was over, and though Zayas hadn't said anything more, his presence alone was enough to signify his stance. There wasn't a need for him to speak again, that would just be a waste of his time. Megian's own thoughts were beginning to waver as well. Maybe she had been overthinking things. Had he really just run into the end of his rope and had nothing more left to give? But then the bang echoed in all of their ears at the same time. One moment, Silas had just been standing there, and in the next, he shot out like a bullet from a cannon. No, Megian's eyes opened wide. It was too fast. Way too fast. At that pace, Silas would burn through his will in just a few steps. He didn't. It was all happening so fast that most didn't even have the time to be shocked in the first place. The gasps were still hanging in the air from Scylla's first initial acceleration. Was he moving faster than any of them had ever seen? No, not even close. But that also wasn't the point. At the pace Scylla's was going, he would break the F-grade record by such a substantial margin that it would look like some sort of rounding error lost in translation. At that pace, he shouldn't have been able to cover more than 100 meters, but he had already covered over 2 kilometers. And he was still accelerating. Zaya's expression slowly grew more serious, his back standing a little straighter. The first rune was coming up. The world blurred into lines of gold around Scylla's, but he saw the rune from a long ways ahead. The crowd on the outside had a far wider scope than he did, but they could only anticipate it. He, however, could feel it. There was a flicker in Scylla's eyes. The rune rearranged itself from over a kilometer away. Scylla's passed through it as though it wasn't even acting as a barrier there. His foot landed on the ground, a ripple passing up his heel, through his calves, and up his quads and hamstrings. The pulse of power would have been enough to shatter the foundation of a home back on Earth, but all that strength and quick twitch suddenness exploded into a forward stride. Scylla's lengthened out his other foot before him, gliding through the air with a gracefulness lost to his speed. His second foot landed on the ground, his eyes flashing with a focused intent and his thoughts on just one thing. Faster. Bang. One after another, the runes fell in a cascade of sparkling lights, and then reformed behind Scylla's with a seamless ease to it. Fluid, smooth, confident, and dauntless. One perfect chime after another filled the air. Megan stood there in silence, watching this scene as though she couldn't believe what she was seeing at all. Who was this man? Chapter 1031. Gold. There's something happening. The Golden Grove is reacting abnormally. The location was a dark space. However, the moment the first person spoke, one floating face after another began to swirl into existence. While they looked to be normally sized, in reality, each face was kilometers across, representing just their reserves of ether. There was no doubt that every one of these old faces was a powerhouse amongst powerhouses, standing firmly within the D grade. Or maybe even the C. Someone is clearing it at an astonishing pace. Given the speed, it feels like someone in the E grade, but the settings are set to F. Has there been a glitch? Impossible. The Golden Grove was left by our ancestors. It wouldn't have a problem. It has been a very long time since it was properly maintained. You know that the Golden Grove is self-healing. Nothing lives forever. There's no problem. A familiar voice echoed. It wasn't Megian's grandfather, but instead Zairoy's. Niavon. What's going on, Niavon? The old bastard found someone who can use Andromeda. That's the person going through the Golden Grove right now. Yes. Silence fell. Is this a problem? If old Brahma has finally found someone who can use that thing, it's good for us. You know as well as I do that Andromeda can't be used, even if it was possible, Niavon said coldly. Silence fell once again. The danger of Andromeda was well known to them. If their enemies knew that it was possible, it would dredge up a great deal of conflict when they weren't nearly ready enough yet. In fact, there were many here that prepared to never be ready at all. It had been so long since the doctrines of their ancestors had been a firm root within them. Wasn't it better to just continue along the current route, making money while not offending anyone? Every time they stepped out of that lane, just how many of them ended up dying? I disagree. A cold voice came. I agreed with suppressing old Brahma because his methods weren't getting us anywhere. All he did was wipe out a substantial amount of our capital for a device that couldn't be used by anyone. But now things have changed. It was the old head of a floating woman that spoke, Yao Yao of the Unatowers. The loss of old Brahma's position had obviously declined the strength the Unatowers had in the guild overall. If there was anyone that wanted to see that situation reversed, it was certainly Yao Yao and her compatriots. But she wasn't alone, and she also wasn't only speaking for personal reasons either. They were a pair of warrior races that seemed to have lost their roots. This wasn't what they were meant to do with the rest of their lives. Plus, there were other races outside of the Unatowers and Aurans that were present right now as well. They might be the main two, but there were more than just two pillars to the guild. Together. Well, that was a story they hadn't spoken of in a very long time. Suddenly, the world they were in trembled before a reply could be made to Yao Yao. Scylla's figure was a blur. Even now, he was still accelerating, his body leaving streaks of green lightning in the air that sparked and latched onto the gold as though to overwhelm it. He could feel the root of the gold here clearly. Poison. It was a poison with both a physical and incorporeal form, attacking both the body and the mind. The first was a cancerous form, weeding its way into the body and turning you into a statue of gold. The latter filled you with a greed for more, making you not realize the danger you were in until it was much too late to do anything about it. This was the suffocating pressure of gold. When Scylla began running, he could feel it pressuring him from all sides, but his poison affinity wasn't minor. More importantly than that, he had runes specially designed to divide and conquer poisons. Because of this, his ability to decipher the runes ahead was even easier. The runes, on the surface, seemed to be matters of controlling wealth. But on a deeper, more invisible plane, it was controlling this poison. How to control vast amounts of wealth. How to make sure the greed in the hearts of your underlings didn't consume them. How to make sure the pursuit of money didn't overwhelm you instead. The underlying meaning of the runes was far deeper than anyone could have imagined. It was then Scylla realized the underlying principles of the Golden Grove weren't so simple at all. They seemed to have formed just like any other merchant guild, just one that happened to be more successful than a lot of others. But in action, they were hiding a secret. A poison that shocked the heart. At the F grade, just the faintest inklings Scylla grasped of it required 60 foundations at worst. Right now, even Scylla's best Glassvault runes were at 70 foundations. There was certainly more to unearth from the Glassvault runes. It was just that Scylla hadn't had a chance to observe anything greater. The runes he observed from the all-seeing eye's fury were purely lightning, and though they helped him push his gene class to a new level, they didn't help elevate his Glassvault runes overall. But right now, observing this poison here, Scylla felt like he was seeing a new world. This was poison. This was the truest extent of what it could be capable of. It wasn't just a corrosion of the body, it was a corrosion of the person. The faster Scylla moved, the more the poison attacked him, and the more he observed. He felt that he could finally see what was missing here. His Glassvault runes. What was their essence? He could distill the strokes of the scorpion in real meaning. But could he do the same for his Glassvault runes? Thoughts of the sky and fury pelting down overwhelmed Scylla. And then he saw it. A throne of glass hanging high in the skies amidst the chaos. His foot slammed down on the road again, lightning erupting from his irises. Bang! Chapter 1032. Essence. The sparks flew across the hard lines of Scylla's face, dancing into his hair and splintering into a rain of chaos. He moved not like the wind, but akin to bolts of fury falling down from the skies. He could feel that throne more clearly now than ever before, and all of a sudden, he could sense the 80 foundation Glassvault rune floating up before him, before it shattered to form a 90 foundation one. His blood boiled, his control reaching another level as every fiber of his being focused on his steps. A second 90 foundation Glassvault rune took shape, and then he felt them growing closer and closer to one another. The outline of a scorpion warlord armor sparked into being around Scylla. He didn't try to form it, but something deep within triggered it all on its own. Boom! Scylla blazed down the trail of gold. The golden foliage to the side tried to reach toward him, but green and violet had begun to practically ooze out of him, the panels of the scorpion warlord armor piecing themselves together. It was just the first layer, and yet it felt so much more powerful than usual, as though it had stepped onto a completely new path. Tendrils of gold began to creep into it, and the black seeped out from Scylla. They intertwined with one another into a mass of savagery that ripped through everything. Scylla's tail flickered again and again. This time, the runes shattered from over 2 kilometers away, beams of light crossing from Scylla's tail toward them and shattering them to complete pieces. There was a relentless fervor to Scylla's movements, as though he wouldn't be satisfied if he stopped accelerating for even a moment. Even if he wasn't becoming just the slightest increment faster, he wanted it. It was a pride surfacing from deep within, a pride he had felt when he faced off against the Rune Mastery Secret Realm. But this time, it seemed to have more to do with poison than any sort of rune mastery. The rune challenges in this secret realm were so blatantly easy to him that he didn't even think about it. It was something else that was attacking his psyche. How could a poison stronger than his own be allowed to exist? In this case, he was ruler of poisons, he stood above them all. Whether in body or in mind, he was superior. Flashes of a malevolent light came from Silas as the roar of a scorpion was practically peeled out of him. Sharp bolts of lightning shattered the roads around him, the branches, leaves, and foliage that attempted to reach toward him tearing themselves to pieces just getting close. The two rooms before Silas seemed to be growing closer and closer together, their 90 foundations seemingly having both a magnetic and repulsive character to them, as though they were meant to be together and yet had no understanding of how to manage it. Silas seemed to forget about the world he was in, forget about the challenge that lay before him, forget about the runes manifesting with every intent of turning him into a golden statue. His irises began to spin in relation to his pupils. He knew he was close, just the slightest bit more, just a little bit extra. And then he'd be there. At that moment, both runes suddenly unraveled, their strokes and foundations becoming bits and pieces of swirling energy in the world. Silas pushed against the energy with his will, embodying that throne of glass in the skies, sitting high above as stormed lightning attempted to corral it. He felt the defiance, the arrogance, the disregard for even the clouds it sat around itself. That essence, Silas knew it intimately. Back then, he had had a choice. To build his throne of glass on the hardship of those before him, or to disregard it all and build up his own path forward. He had chosen the latter, and every moment since then, he hadn't regretted it for a single instant. He didn't want to rely on others. Even for his loved ones, he wanted to be the one that carried all of their burdens for them. He wanted to be that existence in the skies that could be indifferent to even the wrath of the all-seeing eye. To reflect that fury to the world and yet be indifferent to it himself. To be strong. Boom. The road shattered to pieces the next time Silas took a step forward. The gold folded and broke apart. Silas' will had suddenly blown by it, not allowing it to maintain its form or substance. Right then, the strokes of the two unraveled runes pulsed back into being. Under Silas' will, they knew what form they should take naturally, they understood their place in the world beneath his guidance. Much like when Silas sensed the essence of the scorpion through its blood essence, allowing him to draw its runes to perfection, he did it again. This time all on his own. It wasn't the same defiance that the Basilisk King had had, it was something deeper than that. It was a true arrogance. Defiance acknowledged your weakness. Arrogance saw your weakness and didn't believe in it, it kept pressing forward until whatever was in front of it shattered to pieces or you did. It cut off the nose to spite the face. The true essence of what it meant to be a scorpion. It wasn't smart because it didn't have to be. If its arrogance was overwhelmed by the challenge it faced, then it would just die. So what about it? Take its limb, take its tail, an eye, a panel in its armor, its heart, its head. It didn't matter. It would scratch and claw for everything even if it meant it would breathe out its last. Boom. The strokes became foundations. Boom. The foundations fused into one chorus, a harmonious resonance painting across the skies until even the gold seemed entirely too dull. And then it appeared. A glass vault rune with 99 foundations. Chapter 1033. Rip it all down. Boom. It was like the world collapsed in relation to Silas. He soared forward, the road falling from beneath his feet. Title upgraded. A forged will greater than an enlightening will. Your will is truly one of a kind and has forged its own path. Steeped in the scent of greed and gluttony, a suffocating and dominating pride and oppression of absolute obedience, it steps out into the world. While immature and still growing, it has more than carved out its own place, aiming for a peak that the world has rarely yet seen and may never see again. Forge it well, young man. Or die trying. Plus 500 will. Plus 500% will. Plus 1000 charisma. Plus 1000% charisma. Bang. The world shattered, sparks of radiant emerald lightning rippling out from Silas in waves. He roared to the skies, lines of gold, violet, green, and radiant blue taking shape. For a moment, he truly seemed larger than life, his ether pulsing through his veins in waves that made him feel like he was about to pulse at the veins. His glass vault rune was now powerful beyond measure, but his ether pathways ran into the very same problem they always had when his rune mastery surpassed the bounds of reason. They were too weak. 99 runes. It was a concept that an F-tier existence shouldn't even be able to fathom. The theoretical cap of an F-grade rune was 100, and much like rune mastery above 80%, it was something that only really appeared in nature. Of course, there was still a difference between rune foundations and mastery. They weren't exactly the same, so it was much more acceptable for a living being to form a rune with over 90 foundations than it was for that same living being to form a rune with 90% mastery, for example. Even so, 99 foundations was simply ridiculous. What it meant for it to be near the theoretical limit was simple. This meant that controlling ether that came from this rune was likewise right near the theoretical limit of strength possible for an F grade in the first place. Not just in his corner of the universe, but the entire universe. Given the fact there were existences out there with gold and legendary genes, tri and quad class constitution, those descended from shocking races that could only be described as true gods living among the common people. This was a concept difficult for anyone to wrap their heads around. There was simply no way that Silas could take such ether into his body, but the changes were causing a violent uprising in his body nonetheless. Class upgraded. Glassvolt Earl, bronze, greater than Glassvolt Marquis, silver. Veins popped across Silas' body. It felt like he was going to implode from the inside out. His body needed a larger container, a greater vessel. But he just couldn't make it. He could feel that his Glassvolt gene class wanted to race up to the very peak, but he was being held back by something else. His race grade. Silas had never felt more frustrated. Even the event with Nissa couldn't seem to compare to this. He had all the intelligence in the world, he had enough talent to do what others couldn't, and yet his starting position was too insignificant to make it. The gap between the depths a gene class reached and a normal class was too wide. A normal class could extend one's potential, but a gene class demanded more. Without a proper foundation, there was nowhere for it to latch onto. Not only had Silas already reached level 50, leaving him with little room to maneuver in the F grade, but he was only a member of an E grade race. Somehow, Silas could feel that sneer again, looking down at him, laughing, its lip upturned in pure contempt. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do about it this time. Silas coughed up a mouthful of blood and felt like a hand suddenly ripped out from his belly. His ether pathways almost shattered to pieces, and he barely managed to rein it under control because his rune mastery was already at spark mastery. If not for this, he might have well and truly been crippled for life. Back up, Megheen roared. Silas had appeared high above in the trees, the violent rampage of his emerald lightning causing many to directly pass out on impact. There was even a decent number who found themselves injured. And yet, these sparse sparks were just what managed to pull themselves out of Silas' control. I said back up. Megheen turned to Zarius, suddenly growing much taller as the horn on her forehead retreated. A bow of rippling marble white appeared in her palm, and she aimed it at the latter's forehead. Zarius smiled lightly. Are you under the impression that this lightning could harm me? If you are worried for my safety, I will be just fine. I said back up, or I will fire. Megheen's ether thrummed to life in a milky white gold before solidifying into a line of metallic gold that shook the space around it. Its power was off the charts. Class upgraded. Mad Primate, bronze, greater than Primal Lord, silver. Silas' muscles and bones burst at the seams. The crowd was forced to watch in real time as new tissue wiggled out and formed over themselves once more. It seemed that only at that point did there seem to be the slightest semblance of order to Silas' situation, but deep inside, Silas was only growing more furious. He was pissed off. He had done everything right, accomplished what those here couldn't even imagine, and yet he couldn't take the steps he was owed because, what? His starting position was too low. Be strong. He had never felt such a furious urge to do so before. Maybe he still took his advancement for granted even now. Everything came so easily, so smoothly, so indifferently to him. Even this 99 foundation rune was such a breeze. But now he had slammed headfirst into a roadblock he couldn't pass no matter how hard he tried. Suddenly, he made a decision. No matter how long he took, he would rip down that glass ceiling, even if it was the last thing he did. Silas collapsed from the air above, his lightning sparking out. Chapter 1034. Control. Silas' eyes shot open, a coldness radiating from him almost instantly. He felt that his wrist was tied down by a chain, and so was one of his ankles. Other than that, he was completely naked, as though he had been stripped down like a lab rat. The coldness in his eyes had little to do with fury because of this, though. He had already expected as much. And just as he also expected, his scorned wraps were still there, as was his madness key around his neck. Maybe they thought stripping him down would do something, but Silas was probably one of the very few people in this corner of the universe that could be caught and yet not lose the slightest hint of wealth on him. Well, that wasn't necessarily true. Unlike others, he didn't have protections on his genes, so it was very possible for him to lose them. But he very much doubted that would happen. For one, everyone here was probably so used to people having protections on their genes that they didn't even think or consider the possibility of succeeding in the first place, so they never tried. And secondly, Silas' genes weren't very valuable in the grand scheme at all. There was no gene he had on his person now that anyone who could take them in the first place would be interested in. At best, there were his array of silver genes. But he hadn't absorbed them yet to begin with, and he had them tucked away in his madness key. Silas wasn't sure how hard they had tried to take his scorned wraps off. Unlike his madness key, they should at least be visible. But luckily, they didn't go too far in those attempts. At least he didn't see any signs of them going too far. That said, he wouldn't be surprised if there were questions about them. Questions that he, quite frankly, had no intention of answering. Had he taken a risk by going as far as he had? Sure, but that didn't mean that it wasn't a calculated risk. His gaze shifted up to the fluorescent light above him, and then down to what looked like the stainless steel table he lay on. They really were treating him like some sort of lab rat. Silas slowly sat up, his torso flexing, and his arm pulling back against the chain that had him pinned down. He looked at the treasure for the moment and then shook his head. His irises rotated and the runes that made up the chains shattered. It seemed that while they wanted to treat him like a lab rat, they didn't take him nearly seriously enough. Using F-grade treasures to pin him down was like giving him an easy get-out-of-jail-free card. If they had used E-grade treasures instead, he wouldn't have been able to unravel the runes, but clearly, they thought he wasn't worth the investment. Silas slowly stood to his feet, looking down at the vascularity of his arms. This time, it wasn't because his mad primate gene class had become primal lord. The main issue was that he was hungry. So very hungry that his body was practically eating itself alive. He now had 2 silver gene classes working in his body, and that made the state of wealth his thousands of bronze genes had given him suddenly become worthless. His body was hungry for genes. Looking at the door, Silas decided to sit back down. He crossed his legs and closed his eyes, took out a strength silver gene, and then slowly pressed it into his chest. His body shuddered, a pumping, pulsing might radiating through it. Adaptation. That was what his madness control seemed to have become. Originally, Silas didn't understand what it meant, and he didn't have the time to explore it before the inspector came. But after his experience on the Golden Grove Road, he realized that he had already experienced some inklings of it before. When he faced off against the all-seeing eye. Back then, Silas had forced his body into a state of hyper-evolution, pushing it to its brink, forcing himself to experience the line of life and death that the Basilisk King ancestor of Gogo's past had gone through. That brought him closer to the sensation, and he could feel the will of the race with greater clarity. In the end, this helped him to complete the fusion all on his own without relying on the system, and it was this change that triggered the evolution in his gene classes. But there was still something he didn't quite understand. It made sense for Glassvolt to evolve under the pressure of bolts of lightning. But why had his mad primate gene class come to be too? There was something that was missing. But sitting here now, he felt that he understood. In that moment, his madness control had already reached progenitor mastery. It was so seamlessly integrated into his abilities that he rarely if ever actively triggered the start of the skill in the first place. Silas couldn't remember the last time he thought of madness control first before using it. It was practically perpetually active now. That had opened the door to adaptation. What was madness control originally? It was a skill Silas had formed himself within the Slithering Madness dungeon, formed from a fusion of several skills at once. From that moment, he had been building it up all on his own, taking every step himself. Be strong. Those words echoed in his ears time and time again. What was madness control, really? What did adaptation mean? It was exactly what it sounded like. Taking your fate into your own hands, using your will to forge your path ahead. To force your body to evolve by the sheer grit of your teeth and the relentless violence of external pressure. That was what it meant to have madness control. That was what it meant to be a true disciple of madness. A steamy breath left Scylla's lips. He pulled out another silver gene and pressed it against his chest. Chapter 1035. Silver Genes. One after another, Scylla pressed the silver genes into himself. Lost in the intoxication of it all, he forgot about everything around him. Scylla had rarely gotten the chance to integrate with silver genes before this. To feel the simplicity of the basic foundational genes, and yet to also feel their underlying complexities at the same time made him experience true inadequacy. He had thought that his control over his body had already reached the absolute limits of what was possible. He had a hard time fathoming how his control could get more perfect. He had already learned how to use his tendons like whips long ago, and he had only grown more proficient with it. When it came to the efficiency of his muscles, their fluidity of movement, how he shifted his weight in one way for attack and another for defense. The way he broke combat down in his mind was both so complex it could make one's head spin, and yet so intuitive and natural to him that he hardly considered it much of a big deal anymore. But as Scylla was taking in these silver genes, and even the bronze genes before, he was experiencing something different. He didn't realize just how much his mixed martial arts comprehension of before, and his current mixed demonic arts, had influenced his combat style. Scylla hadn't faced anyone he felt overwhelmed him in skill in close combat, or just combat in general, since the very first few months of the summoning. Since then, he suffocated every opponent he came across, outmaneuvering them and making them feel like children on wobbling legs. Part of that was just because he was mostly fighting other Earthlings, but in that mix, there were a great deal of powerhouses too with far more experience. Like the Sylphs. Scylla's thought that meant that he was on the right track with everything. But as he pressed these silver genes into himself, he realized that there was something different. Power. He wasn't overwhelming most of those experienced opponents with skill alone. He was outsmarting many of them, sure. But that wasn't necessarily a matter of skill. His mind was just more nimble than others. At the same time, he was just stronger than most of the opponents he came across. His stats might seem weaker, but his effectiveness was off the charts, and the unique array of abilities he had made up whatever remaining gap there was. When he got his mixed martial arts comprehension, it only made the gap more exaggerated. His skill gained a cheat where it could read and assimilate the skill of those he came across, allowing him to outsmart them with even greater ease because he had an understanding of their combat styles that most opponents they came across wouldn't have. But what about when his stats truly weren't strong enough to keep up? What about when his mixed demonic arts comprehension couldn't keep up or wasn't strong enough to make a difference? If he stripped all of that away from himself, became a mere mortal, and had to fight against another true expert? Just how much skill would he truly have? His mind drifted to the fist, kick, and various other martial arts methods he had mastered for the sake of bolstering his combat ability. He couldn't help but wonder. Why had he stopped doing that after he integrated with his mixed martial arts comprehension? Now, he was in this wider world, with such a large selection of martial arts to dip his toes into. Just how much more did he have to learn? Scylla pressed the final silver gene into his chest. That's it, I managed it. He didn't know how much longer he would be able to conveniently get himself gene elixirs, especially when he was on the verge of the E grade. But at least now, he could manage it well enough. Right now, his gene state was flexible, and that gave him a 65% chance. With Taboo Bond, he was able to tweak his free chaos to make his success rate practically 100%. This was something he realized he could do during his bronze gene absorbing session. But with the E-grade looming overhead, not only would E-grade gene state elixirs be much harder to find, but it would be a whole new ordeal to upgrade Taboo Bond to level 95 to access free chaos again. I'll have to see if I can establish some sort of other method. Otherwise, my progress in the E-grade will slow to a crawl. The door to Scylla's cage rushed open. Well, it wasn't really a cage, just a lab room. but it might as well have been. Megan charged in, and her eyes immediately opened wide when she saw Silas just sitting there. Then her eyes shifted to the chains on the ground. You. At that moment, the last of the wounds on Silas' body were closing in real time. Her eyes opened even wider. She didn't seem embarrassed in the slightest that Silas was naked. That seemed to be more of a problem when it was herself. As for others, it didn't matter much. The last time she had seen Silas, he was as sickly as could be, a hole quite literally leaking in his gut. But right now, he looked like he had just awakened from a casual nap. His healing factor, when had it suddenly become so good? And why was the aura he was radiating right now so strong? Somehow, she felt inferior, but that was impossible. She was almost at the D grade. There was no way an F grade could make her feel inferior unless he was from a much higher race. But the Unitaurs were a D grade race. The galaxy that Silas came from could never produce such a human. Not to mention the fact Silas would have to be in the C grade to make her feel so oppressed, but that was even more impossible. Megan was so distracted that she forgot what she had to say. Before she could regain her bearings, exactly what she didn't want to happen did. Zarius walked in, his eyes moving down to the chains shattered on the ground. Chapter 1036. Sleep. Not after a good start, I see. Zarius said with a smile. Silas didn't reply. The man hadn't looked him in the eye since he stepped into the room. Even now, he was still looking at the chains on the ground until he looked up to meet what seemed to be the back of Megan's head. As though they had perfectly timed it, Megan looked back to Zarius with an annoyed flare in her movements. You. I wouldn't say too much if I were you, Zarius said lightly. This is my jurisdiction right now, and technically speaking, you could be detained for coming here without permission. I'll give you some leeway as my fiancé, but don't say anything that would make this harder on you. Megan choked on her words, feeling a bit helpless all of a sudden. Then she almost took it out on Silas. If he hadn't done something ridiculous like breaking those chains or suddenly healing from those ridiculous injuries, she would have managed to say what she needed to. Zarius pulled something out of a spatial device and tossed it onto the stainless steel table. You can wear those to cover up your decency. We will be placing you before the council now, but I will have to report this infraction. An attempted escape will unfortunately make whatever sentence you receive harsher or less beneficial depending on the way they decide. Silas looked toward the clothing. It was practically just a medical gown of some sort, and honestly, it wouldn't be covering up any decency at all. Not only was it incredibly flimsy to the point that it was practically see-through, but it was short. Silas could tell at a glance it wasn't tailored to his body at all, especially not after his changes. He stepped down from the table, completely ignoring the gown. His body flexed and stretched, a crackling sound that made the air whine, echoing before runes flashed across him. In a blink, a new set of beast skin clothing had covered him. It was nothing more than a show since they had come directly from his madness key. But they didn't need to know that. Zeroy's eyes narrowed, seemingly looking at Silas for the first time. Quote ellipsis. I don't know who you were in your own world, but this is a stage much larger than you now. I would advise caution. Silas didn't reply. Zarius gave him another glance and turned away. Megan tried to open her mouth to say something, but it was the voice of her grandfather that came to interrupt her this time. That's enough, Meg, come here. Silas found himself standing on an elevated platform, a fence of elaborately sculpted wood. But the courtroom that surrounded him in a ring was completely empty. Seats that presumably should have had people in them were vacant. Instead, there were what looked like projected lights, but these lights, other than adding to a somber ambience, didn't do much else. It didn't seem like they'd be taking the shape of anyone anytime soon. Silas raised an internal eyebrow, but eventually just closed his eyes. His breathing became rhythmic, and the runes of the world seemed to coalesce around him, forming a support structure of space that kept him upright. Then he fell asleep. The hours ticked by, and Silas' rhythmic breathing didn't stop. He just fell into a deeper and deeper sleep. At some point, the runes around him accumulated so much that there was a natural glow to him. Even those who weren't rune masters began to notice something particularly odd. At least those still paying attention to what was happening. Silas had never been the sort of person to care very much about disrespect. Ironically enough, he had just gotten quite furious with the all-seeing eye, so it was a bit amusing that he'd have such a thought now. But were these people on the same level as the all-seeing eye? Maybe it was more accurate to say that Silas couldn't take disrespect he saw from most people seriously. Whether it was the Grimblades who had tried to control his every action, or Lucius who tried to command him, or the Golden Grove now. The only times he truly got pissed was when he felt a true lack of control over the situation. And quite frankly, that very rarely happened. And this was certainly not one of those incidents. Finally, one after another, the lights before the chairs began to coalesce into real people. Many were Unataurs and Aurans, but there were those of other races as well, many of whom had odd golden glows to them as though this was the only color they could be. There were some human-looking races that just seemed to have blonde hair and golden eyes. There was a lizard-like race with the heads of what looked like gold-scaled alligators but the bodies of humans. There was even a beautiful, somewhat plump woman on the ground with the aura of a silkworm. The silkworm-like race woman didn't have hair in the normal sense, but rather had a mass of smooth flesh covered in patterns of white gold along its length. This mass split into two and looked almost like if flesh had taken the shape of a pair of ponytails. The kindness she used was almost sickening, not in a sociopathic way, but in a way one really couldn't bear to hurt her at all. And then came a familiar, Buddha-like man and a Yao-Yao, an old woman of the Unataur race. They brought order to their court, and then every one of them looked to Silas, who still had his eyes closed. At first, many thought he was just arrogant and instantly felt some discontent. But then they heard his rhythmic breathing, and the truth settled in. This guy, he was actually sleeping. A silence fell in the room. Sleep wasn't something most of them would need. Even for an F grade, staying up for 2 or 3 days shouldn't be a problem, not to mention the fact Silas had just been resting for several days until now. Plus, even if Silas was tired, which he shouldn't be in the first place, even a mortal wouldn't be able to sleep in what should be a stress-filled situation. What was going on here? How could he be so relaxed? The runes around Silas buzzed as though being awakened to the situation. Silas slowly opened his eyes, a radiant, oppressive charisma causing many projections to flicker involuntarily. It felt like the runes used to form them might collapse at any moment. Chapter 1037. Because I do. Silas calmly scanned the room, making eye contact with at least most of those who could manage to keep their images from floundering uncontrollably. There was an unexplained serenity to him, as though he had already seen too much to care about such minor matters at all. But it was this calmness that made those observing him feel the need to sit up just a little bit straighter in their seats. It was difficult to get a read on the current Silas, and to their astonishment, they found that without their real bodies here, they couldn't read his stats either. Of course, they didn't know that this wasn't just because Silas was astonishing, but also that he had yet to fully integrate with the wider system. Summoning worlds had their own scales to deal with. Usually, outside of this, there were the scales on a galaxy level that one had to contend with. Even so, though every power on a large enough scale had their own system integration to deal with, it could still be converted easily enough, much the same way Silas didn't even speak the language of these people, but could understand them. However, as a method of protection, summoned worlds were placed in a different category for obvious reasons. If Silas' stats were too good, that could easily cause many to wonder why that was the case, and it would place Earth in danger. Not that he was doing a very good job of hiding the fact that they were at this point. Of course, it also had to be said that Silas' ability to understand languages other than his own came from his will and ancient Ithkal more than it did the system's help. But that was hardly relevant now. Not when he was being ogled 10 different ways by dozens of D-grade and maybe even above powerhouses. But Silas certainly wasn't going to be the first one to speak. This seemed like it was only natural. After all, he should be the defendant in this situation. But somehow, the longer he said nothing, the more those around him felt uncomfortable, as though he should be at least greeting them first in order to show them some respect. The silence grew longer and longer until it was another figure who walked in that finally fixed things. Zarius. I've been called in today in an attempt to mediate things. I'll have to thank my seniors for trusting me with this process. Though Zarius knew that he was here only to help these old fogies save some face for themselves, he was quite good at twisting a light that would otherwise cause him to pale into one that made him shine quite well. The Golden Grove Council of Elders only has some questions about you and our origins, Scylla's Grimblade. As far as we understand it, you originate from a Sky 11,331 galaxy and are currently the Tsar of a Level 30 Bazaar, is that correct? That's correct. Zarius gave Scylla a once-over, seemingly not prepared for him to answer so smoothly. Didn't he just have his lips sealed tight? Something within the young heir adjusted as he felt that Scylla's wasn't what he was expecting. Which world are you from? A summoned world, Scylla's replied simply, another answer that made Zarius pause. And which world is that? Where is it located? Scylla's didn't bother to reply. He just stared at Zarius, his expression not changing. Non-answers will go into the public record as such, Zarius said simply. Scylla's didn't respond once again. Zarius nodded. Your rune mastery, where did you learn it? Mostly on my own. Mostly, what does this mean? I have a master. And who would that be? Scylla's didn't respond. Zarius nodded. Your rune armor is very familiar. It carries with it accents of the Thriskai rune armor. Is your master a Thriskai? No. Zarius seemed taken aback by this answer once again. He had been expecting either a non-answer once again, or a confirmation. This was not what he was expecting, however. Why would Scylla's not tell them who his master was, and yet draw such a clear line now? For a moment, Zarius didn't know what question to ask next. They had spent a while analyzing the armor, and they were sure of their answer. But back then, Scylla's had only used the first layer because he was focused on trying to refine a poison unique to himself. Because of all the color changes and wool fluctuations, picking out the specific form of the Scorpion Warlord armor had become several times more difficult. As distorted as it all had become, they could only make faint recollections of what they were used to seeing. But now they were suddenly lost. The obvious answer was that Scylla's was lying, but this room was too special. The wool detection methods they had were too strong. Lying in the face of it was far too difficult. In that case, why won't you tell us who your master is? Scylla's tilted his head to the side. Are you insinuating that you have some sort of conflict with the Thriskai? Zaroy's gaze sharpened. He realized that he had made a mistake with the choice of his words, mostly out of confusion, but that didn't mean he was okay with Scylla's pointing it out. Unfortunately, there was no easy way for him to rebut this. In case you've forgotten, it's you on trial, not the Golden Grove. Your answers are peculiar. Why would you refuse to make your master known, and yet draw such a clear line between yourself and the Thriskai? Do you have a conflict with them? Yes. Zarius was floored again. The Thriskai are cowards that targeted my summoning world. I don't have a particular fondness for them, so I don't like the assumption that I am under the care of one. As for why I won't tell you who my master is, it's because I'm not sure who he is, where he is, or if it would be helpful to me to mention him. As far as I'm concerned, it's better that you're in the dark so you can assume him to be a great figure even in the case that he isn't. Wouldn't that keep me safer? Chapter 1038. Okay. Scylla's words were so logical that Zarius had no rebuttal to them at all. It was more shocking than anything else that he had said it all so boldly. Usually, these were schemes that people played in the dark, but Scylla's laid it all out on the table as though he truly had nothing to hide. All of a sudden, it felt like the atmosphere in the room shifted. At the start, even Yao, who was otherwise in favor of Scylla's, had found herself frowning. But now, a light smile had curled her lips, her wrinkles deepening just the slightest bit. They had all lived enough life to have been around eccentric personalities. Those like Scylla's, geniuses who weren't the best socially but were very straightforward in their actions and word choice, were the type that were the most annoying to be around if you were their enemy, and yet also the most endearing if you were a friend. Of course, these old fogies had little clue that Scylla's wasn't so socially inept. He was quite good at reading a room, deciphering emotions, and acting upon them. It was just that in this case, he had decided that the best path forward was this personality, and he had been proven correct with great immediacy. Do you understand what you've just said? Zarius said slowly. Are you very afraid of the Thriskai? Scylla's asked. You. Who wasn't afraid of the Thriskai in this region of the universe? It wasn't a problem of their mortals, but there were the demigods above them, and the gods above them. The Thriskai that Scylla's was used to were the mere mortals that couldn't scrape the shoes of the demigods clean. Yet, The Golden Grove, who was very apprehensive in the face of the demigods, was well aware that the demigods were to the gods what their mortals were to them. Silas might only be familiar with the weakest form of the Thriskai who the Golden Grove could manage more than well enough. But his ignorance was shining forth too boldly. Who knew how the Thriskai might react if they heard of his words today? To call them cowardly. One of the gods might choose to smite the entire guild to ash. How ridiculous. And yet, Silas was pretending like he was the coward here. He was just being foolish. Unfortunately, no matter how much logic was on Zayroy's side, he knew that he had lost today. This was especially so since not long ago, a demigod had come to antagonize their elder council. This was a public affair that had shaken the entire Golden Grove. No matter how right Zarius was, Silas' words were endearing and from the heart, while he was essentially playing defense for an enemy that had humiliated them all not long ago. It almost didn't matter what he did from now on. In the eyes of some elders, his stock had taken a permanent hit. Fury bubbled in Zayroy's heart, but to his credit, he maintained his composure. Council Elder Neavon, I've asked all of the preliminary questions I can. You are free to take it from here. Zarius bowed to his grandfather and then moved to the side. If nothing else, Zayroy's willingness to take a step back had regained him some favor. But that bad taste in his mouth returned. When he looked at Silas now, though his gaze was calm, there was a venom that Silas could sense very clearly. It prickled at his will like a viper. Silas ignored him, looking up at the Buddha-like man. Even as a projection, his belly was akin to a powerful golden gong, stealing with his every slight moment and reverberating with his breath. Do you know what a uniform is, child? I do not. Are you aware of what it means to have a will ability of both time and space? A what? Silas asked. Silence fell. Suddenly, they recalled that Silas was from a summoned world. There truly were many things that he would be entirely unaware of. However, his reply also answered the question. Andromeda is the uniform that old Brahma would like to put you in charge of. But as the saying goes, great power comes with great responsibility. A uniform is the product of countless resources the Golden Grove has poured, and often wasted. One in use is one less that we have. Doesn't seem like it was in use, Silas replied. Yao Yao chuckled slightly. She was probably the only one present who would dare do such a thing right now, or had the animosity with the Buddha-like man to do so. But it was funny nonetheless. Silas might be ignorant, but he wasn't stupid. Neavon's approach, though, clearly was. Neavon didn't show any displeasure to Silas' reply even if he did have any. Indeed, I won't deny that you're a rare talent that can make use of this uniform, but you haven't been the first. The others just couldn't be trusted, and you don't seem to have displayed any qualities worth trusting. As honest as you've been about your intentions, withholding information couldn't possibly net you one of the most powerful treasures in the galaxy cluster, could it? You want to know who my master is? And where your world is? Well, that one won't be happening, Silas replied casually. If you just want to know who my master is, I can do that. But only under the condition that you won't ask that question again. Silas met the eyes of a figure who would practically be a god on earth without much of a fluctuation in his expression. Neavon likely had enough power right now to blast Earth to pieces. Granted, that would be because Earth had yet to finish its evolution, but it would be the truth nonetheless. Neavon's eyes finally narrowed, but it was Yao Yao who spoke this time. Granted, tell us who your master is, and provide proof. Then I can allow this. The system wouldn't allow us to interfere with a summoned world, anyway. Neavon is being a bit overzealous. Silas nodded. Okay. He took out a familiar badge. The room froze over instantly. Chapter 1039. Grelith Duskthorn. The 713th Scorpion Warlord, Grelith Duskthorn. Silas had heard the name before, he just had no idea what sort of weight it held. And in truth, in the Sky 11331 galaxy, it held none, much like Silas had guessed. Sometimes, having backing that was too powerful for a given situation was as good as having no backing at all. In this case, that couldn't have been more true. To the Sky 11331 galaxy, Grelith Duskthorn might as well have been a nobody, an entity so high up they couldn't even fathom him. It was akin to asking an ant what the sun meant to it when it couldn't even complete complex thoughts of its own. Of course, That had just been one worry of Scylla's, which was why he never bothered to take it out. Although Grelith was likely aware of which galaxy he was in, and thus wouldn't tell Scylla's to use it unless he had decent enough understanding of it, Scylla's wasn't someone who liked to rely on anyone other than himself. There was a very real possibility to Scylla's that the Beast Warlord Sanctum was great enemies with this section of the universe, and thus bringing it out, even if those around him did know of Grelith, would just mean thrusting himself into even more danger. But now, Scylla's wasn't in the dark anymore. While he still didn't know the weight behind Grelith's name, what he did know was that the Beast Warlord Sanctum was the ruler of an adjacent galaxy cluster to this one. And, not only was this galaxy cluster far more powerful than the Golden Grove, but the Golden Grove didn't have a hostile relationship with the Beast Warlord Sanctum. In fact, from what Scylla's could pick up from the various auras around him, many of the Elder Council had actually come from the Beast Warlord Sanctum, where races built upon a foundation of beasts were extremely common. The Silkworm Elder, the Unatowers, the Golden Lizard Elder. Any number of those here could very easily find their family roots in the Beast Warlord Sanctum. But for various reasons, they had ended up here. As for why Scylla's knew Grelith had to be one of the most powerful of the Beast Warlord Sanctum. It was in his title. He called himself the 713th Scorpion Warlord. That meant one of two things. Either there was 713 or more active Scorpion Warlords right this moment, and this denoted his rank. Or, he was the 713th successor to the title. It didn't matter which one was the truth. Earth alone had tens of billions of people before the summoning. What did it mean to be top 1000 in anything the entire planet could participate in? To say that 99th percentile was an understatement. In practice, this would mean that Grelith was the 99th percentile, of the 99th percentile, of the 99th percentile, of the 99th percentile. And that was just if this was Earth one was speaking of. This wasn't Earth. It wasn't just a planet that had had far more time to grow into its own. It wasn't just a star system. It wasn't just a quadrant. It wasn't just a galaxy. It was a galaxy cluster. Just how many trillions upon trillions of people would be involved in such a count? And then there was the second possibility. The possibility that Grelith was the 713th successor. That amongst all the Scorpion warlords of his generation, of all those that attempted and failed to even join in the first place, he was chosen as the one who rose above them all. Regardless of which it was, Scylla's statement was the utmost truth. And it just so happened that it was the latter that was the reality of the situation. The 713th Scorpion Warlord, Grelith Duskthorn. He was no normal man. He was no normal rune master, either. Amongst all the C-grade existences in this, Grelith Duskthorn was ranked 71st in this sector. World, star system, quadrant, galaxy, galaxy cluster, and only then would one speak of sectors. These involved numbers of people that couldn't even be fathomed, and amongst all the C-tier existences alive right this moment, Grelith stood in the top 100 of them all. If it was this alone, maybe it would be just fine. But in this entire sector, not only was Grelith Duskthorn the 71st strongest C-grade warrior, he was also the 113th best C-grade rune master, and one of only just over 160 or so rune flesh C-grade rune masters in the entire sector. The weight of the badge that Scylla's had just taken out could hardly be described in words alone. It didn't feel like he was holding a normal badge at all, but instead an entire sector in the palm of his hands. Zarius looked around in confusion, clearly not having the same experience as his elders. But he could read their reactions well enough. Whatever Scylla's had just taken out was heavy. So heavy that he realized he might have already offended someone that he well and truly never should have. Niavon stared at the badge for a long while, unable to gather his thoughts. Yao Yao was much the same. She had no idea what she would see when Scylla's took out his badge, but this was certainly not what she was expecting. As for Scylla's himself, he was completely indifferent to it all. He already knew that this would happen, that was why he had played the part of the fool. Now, there were two paths this Elder Council could take. Either they could pretend they didn't know who Grelith was, or they would do a complete 180 on their views. Either way, this didn't necessarily help Scylla's. That was because him having such a background might make them apprehensive of him for different reasons. Would they be fattening up a child for another parent to love? What would they do once Silas just went to the Beast Warlord's sanctum? Silas, though, had his own plans for that. His lips slowly parted. Chapter 1040. No. Silas flipped his palm and the badge disappeared as though he was afraid of people staring at it for too long. Then he spoke. There's really only 3 ways this can go. Either you don't know or care who my master is after seeing that badge and choose to steamroll me, you know who he is and are on about equal footing, or you know exactly who he is and are feeling a little afraid right now. Assuming it's the first, then you all probably don't have much to worry about. You can try to poach me, though I can't guarantee that will work. If it's the latter, the situation is a bit more complicated. Assuming it's the second, the same conclusion applies. Whether you're hostile with the Beast Warlord's sanctum or not, it's obvious I haven't stepped foot there just yet. As far as you're all concerned, poaching a talent from an enemy should be more important to you than killing an F grade. And assuming it's the third, well, there are 2 ways that could also go. The less likely possibility is that you're hostile with the Beast Warlord's sanctum. Though, I don't understand how you have such a relationship with a power you see as far above you. I'll entertain the concept for a moment. In such a case, poaching me might bring down ire that you cannot fathom. So, again, letting me go would be your best option. But then there's the other path. This one assumes you have a neutral or positive relationship with the Beast Warlord's sanctum and it happens to be far more powerful than you. Understanding this, handing me the keys to your uniform might not help you at all, it'll just harm you. If my master comes and I decide I want to take it with me, the odds that you'd be able to stop me are very low. But that's already the case right now, isn't it? Silas' gaze scanned over them all one by one. There was a calmness about him as he went through the thoughts the elders here might have had, despite the fact he knew well that the last of the 3 options was the only one they were considering. That much was obvious because their reactions to Silas' words right then were the fiercest. Indeed, Silas might not know what Andromeda was, but Grelith certainly would. If he knew that his disciple could make use of his uniform, why wouldn't he help Silas take it? There was too little known about the character of Grelith and other powerhouses like him. They rarely cared to step out into the world anyway. For all they knew, Grelith was too prideful to take something from a weaker party. But could they guarantee that? No. And they certainly couldn't risk such a thing either. It would be the end of them. Or would it? Andromeda had just been sitting there for who knows how long. Even those that could manage to use a portion of its power just ended up dead. Silas was the only one that had managed to trigger its use and actually survive unharmed. Not only that, but he had cleared the Golden Grove with a speed that even more E grades couldn't match. Granted, that was under F grade pressure, and not E grade, but it was all set relative to the person taking it nonetheless. So the way I see things, you have a few options. Either you chain me up and make use of me because the Beast Warlord's sanctum is weak. You try to poach me and treat me as one of your own. Or you ship me off to the Beast Warlord's sanctum as quickly as possible and hope I don't come back demanding Andromeda be handed to me. A heavy silence fell. Somehow, even with all these powerhouses present, Silas steered the conversation. Yao Yao couldn't help but sigh. Maybe it only made sense that the first talent they managed to find capable of making use of Andromeda was already taken by a far superior power. If it had been so easy to find talents like Silas among the dregs of the universe, they would have done so long ago. Of course, there is a 4th option, Silas said calmly. I've already stepped into Andromeda and I know how much information it gives me access to. I bet the more I use it, the more used to it I will get, and the more information I'll be able to diagnose, understand, and decipher through in single sittings. Even if you hide my master's origins from me, assuming he is cut from the 2nd or 3rd options, it'll only be a matter of time before I can delve deep enough to find out myself. So I propose something else. As you can tell, I'm quite talented, but my greatest weakness is how little information I have on hand. I don't have the same foundation you all do. I will admit that the idea of being able to process so much information so fast is almost intoxicating in a way. So, I am willing to form a system link right now. In this contract, we can decide terms of how I can use the uniform, and we can also place clauses within it that don't allow me to take the uniform for myself outside of personal time with it that I'll be asking for. So, I am willing to form a system link right now. In this contract, we can decide terms of how I can use the uniform, and we can also place clauses within it that don't allow me to take the uniform for myself outside of personal time with it that I'll be asking for. Yao Yao's eyes narrowed, but it was Niavon who spoke. You're a clever boy. Isn't an agreement from us to sign this contract as good as admitting that your master is powerful to you? Maybe, but that only depends on how you look at it. The contract will be personally signed by me, and your wills are all more powerful than I am by a substantial margin. A contract only holds as much weight as the two wills involved. You could use this as a method of control. The atmosphere became oppressive. And you expect us to believe that you're willing to do this? Tell the truth. You're only so willing because you know exactly how powerful your master is. Is that right? No, I don't, Silas said indifferently. It's just that wills don't remain stagnant. Even if you break your word and use it to control me now, soon enough the situation will reverse and I'll surpass you. This concludes the chapters for today. To continue the journey, be sure to find the next chapters on our channel. If you're excited about this story as we are, please like this video and subscribe. You can also leave a comment with your thoughts on this chapters.